for your patience. Sorry for the slight delay at the start there. Good morning and welcome. This is if this is your first time to a webinar by SOS Online Backup, this is something that we do very regularly. My name is Ken Shaw. I'm the CEO of SOS, and I'm joined here today by Herb Kraft, our General Counsel and resident HIPAA expert, and by Lynn Weber, our Medical Solutions Specialist. Lynn spent 10 years selling into the healthcare industry prior to joining us, and really has a lot of great expertise and knowledge that we can bring to bear. And today, what we'd like to do is to go through HIPAA as it relates to healthcare providers and medical businesses, and specifically your electronic protected health information, or EPHI. In terms of the agenda for the webinar, it'll be a roughly 30-minute presentation followed by a Q&A session at the end. And we'll walk through who SOS is and SOS's company history. We'll then turn and look at the backup and disaster recovery industry, specifically looking at technologies prevalent among medical businesses and some of the common misconceptions about certain types of backup technology, like removable hard disk drives or tape-based backup, and how that then can interact with the HIPAA regulations. We'll turn into a brief overview of the HIPAA regulations and specifically what the requirements are around backup and the protection of electronic protected health information under HIPAA, and then look at the SOS technology itself and how it can help you be in compliance with HIPAA as well as solve all of your backup and disaster recovery needs generally. The audience for today's webinar is really anybody affected by the HIPAA regulations, which cast a fairly broad net, but typically healthcare providers. So we've got a lot of registrants today. I'll look briefly through the list. There are pharmaceutical businesses here, pharmacies, chiropractors, physiotherapists. So we've got a wide array of healthcare-related businesses here today, which is great. We'll do a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and then there'll actually be a special offer for everybody who attends today's webinar. We've got a special offer for all of you, which you can call in to get access to. So without further ado, let's jump in. So who is SOS Online Backup? We're a company formed nearly a decade ago, specifically to focus on what was then a very young industry, the online backup and remote backup industry. Since then, we've expanded rapidly. We're a very substantial company today. We've got more than 200 employees worldwide. We're one of the largest online backup firms by various metrics, 4 global locations around the world. I'm here in our Los Angeles office, but we've got operations in Asia and also in Europe. 10 data centers around the world, so a very comprehensive data protection grid, and then more than 3 million customer accounts on our system. So there are nearly 10 million PCs being protected by the SOS technology and infrastructure globally at any given time. I highlight all of that because we get one of the most common questions we get asked from businesses who we're talking to is just who are you, how long have you been in business, how stable a partner are you, and hopefully that's answered those questions. One thing I should have mentioned at the beginning of the webinar is you can actually ask questions at any time throughout the webinar. So in the GoToWebinar software, there's an option to ask a question. Please feel free to use that at any time, and you don't need to hold your questions until the end. We like to have these sessions be as interactive as possible. So we get a lot more out of it, and we think the audience gets a lot more out of it when there's a good back and forth of questions and answers. So please feel free to use that question functionality at any time. Okay. So in terms of who are the markets that we focus on, we're very much a business-focused service provider. So there are, depending, I don't know what the level of knowledge is among the audience about online backup, but it's now a very well-established space. It's roughly $1 billion industry annually, growing to $6 or $7 billion, depending on who you listen to. And there are many providers. In terms of major providers in the space, we are pretty much the only provider who's always focused on the small business sector. So our sweet spot is businesses from anywhere from 1 employee to thousands of employees. And I think that probably aligns pretty closely with the audience we've got here today. So let's look now and turn to HIPAA itself, and how HIPAA relates to you and what its data protection requirements are. This is a subject matter that's not well understood and can create a lot of concern among people and medical business, anybody affected by it. So what we'd like to attempt to do today is try and cut through some of that noise and show you just how simple it can be to have comprehensive backup for your business, as well as be in compliance with all the rules and regulations that HIPAA imposes upon you, which has made backup of EPHI a lot more complex than it needs to be. So just for a brief primer on HIPAA, in terms of who is covered by HIPAA, this is a very common question that we get. There are two key rules under the HIPAA regulations, being the privacy rule and the security rule, and they apply to what's called a covered entity. So, I mean, the real test is whether or not you fall into that category of covered entity. What we want to do here today is really cut through a lot of the complexity there. Generally, most of the audience today are covered entities, so it covers everything from doctors, clinics, psychologists, chiropractors, nursing homes, pharmacies, hospitals, anybody who's really related to the healthcare business and is storing anything to do with customer healthcare in electronic records. Looking at what is covered specifically, the technical name for the information that's covered by HIPAA is EPHI. I've referred to that a couple of times. So in the Act, that's electronic protected health information, and that's the data that patients have a right for the healthcare provider or center to guarantee discretion with and control over. It's necessary for all of those confidential records, obviously, not to be compromised and can't be accessed by people who don't have the required authority. So what are the typical types of information in a healthcare business that are going to be covered by this? Prescription data, medical history logs, appointment records, phone and voicemail data, insurance documents, billing records. It's not limited to that list, but really any of the information associated that you've got stored associated with patient care is going to be covered. Okay, and so what are specifically the requirements of HIPAA as it relates to your data backup? Let me backtrack a little bit and start by saying that HIPAA is a large animal. There are many elements to HIPAA compliance, and what we're focusing on here today is that part of HIPAA that relates specifically to the protection and backing up of electronic protected health information. But what we've discovered is that data backup is actually one of the areas that is often neglected and often overlooked when it comes to HIPAA compliance. So often the medical information systems that are being used, for example, in a clinic might be HIPAA compliant, but the data backup is unencrypted and you've got data sitting on DVDs or removable hard disk drives that are therefore actually a breach of all the regulations. Security isn't there, encryption isn't there, you don't have access controls. So what we actually find is that when you look at doing, say, a HIPAA compliance audit of your business, your data backup is very commonly something that's fallen outside the purview of the initial assessment. The Act actually goes further. Under the security rule, there are very specific requirements when it comes to what covered entities need to do with regard to backup. So there are 7 points on the screen actually referencing various sections of the regulations. But in brief, let me walk through what the regulations require. Firstly, you've got to have a data backup plan. Secondly, you've got to have a disaster recovery plan, which is different. And whereas the data backup plan is targeted toward how the data is to be backed up, disaster recovery plan is more toward how business continuity is going to be restored in the case of a total data loss. An emergency mode operations plan along with emergency access procedures, and then there is a compulsory requirement to have comprehensive data backup and storage with contingency operations, and then most importantly that data is all encrypted and can only be accessed by the appropriate and authorized personnel. So, a little overwhelming and can be quite difficult for particularly small healthcare businesses to understand, which is where we come in. SOS has got a solution that really takes care of all of these elements for you and makes the entire data protection lifecycle extremely simple and extremely affordable. So we actually had a little survey running on the beginning of the webinar for people who arrived early to the webinar room to poll who was using what types of technology. We actually had 50% of people say they didn't know what was their backup, and that's not unusual. It's one of, as I said earlier, it's one of the oft overlooked areas of HIPAA compliance within a medical business. But then the other common technologies that we see are tape, disc, and even archiving to DVD and CD is still very common. And at a high level, I'll say this: none of these technologies are HIPAA compliant. So from a regulatory compliance standpoint, if your business is relying upon any of these backup technologies to back up EPHI, you're not HIPAA compliant, and that there's risk associated with that. Secondarily, I would say that all of these technologies have been superseded, and they're expensive to run, and they provide you with a low quality of backup service. And we'll look at each in turn in a moment. But just at a high level, what we would posit as a company, we're a little biased, but we're an online backup vendor. Nevertheless, online backup represents a far greater quality of backup service at a far lower total cost of ownership for any business, not just medical businesses. And in addition, you've got strong incentive to look at online backup as a solution, because really none of these existing incumbent technologies are HIPAA compliant. Looking at tape, traditional tape backup solutions with rotating of tapes off-site, it can actually be very expensive. We'll look at an example of the costs associated with typical tape backup in a few slides' time. But tape backups are fundamentally insecure. People can access them generally. They're generally not then stored in physically secure off-site storage. The data on the tapes is very rarely secure from a technology standpoint. It's very rarely encrypted. Tapes fail. In fact, IBM estimates that more than 60% of tapes fail over their lifetime, which means that you actually then need massive redundancy built in. And tape is a very expensive solution. Turning to disk, which has become more and more common over the last 5 years, off-site storage is still required, and actually rotating that disk off-site manually can be very inconvenient, can be very expensive for your business. You've got